Hey, what's going on, guys? So today's video is going to be a topic that I've wanted to discuss for a while. Something that has just been floating around in my head for a couple of weeks. Now, what you're seeing here is I'm just changing some of my assists. This is the first time I've raced in like a year or more, maybe a year and a half. And I wanted to go in and change a couple things real quick. So I just changed to, manual without a clutch. Using the clutch, I don't know, it doesn't seem to really offer much benefit at these high, like F1 type, what do you call it? These like F1 type races doesn't help. So I turned that off, and then I actually turned traction off too. I've been watching this series called Formula One Drive to Survive on Netflix, which is a phenomenal series and really made me excited to watch F1. I've never watched F1 before, but it made me super excited to watch it. And so I was like, I'm going to come in here and do some F1 racing. And I was like, I'm going to turn the traction off. I'm going to be a purist and turn the traction off and see what I can do. And man, let's just listen. I'll let you guys listen to the audio here so you can see how absolute of an animal this car is. Yeah, absolute animal, right? And, it's very hard to drive without traction, especially when you haven't driven for a year and a half. But the car's so sensitive, and now my tires are ultra hot. If you look down at my little HUD and my tack in the middle right there, my tires are hot, so now I can't even keep the car straight. But I just wanted to do this for fun, and I thought it was pretty satisfying. And then the later clip on here is me driving a Aston Martin V12 Vantage, which was a sick car. But anyways, you'll see me struggling with the driving here. This is literally my first 2 races or whatever, first 2-3 races in a year and a half. So. But today's video, I want to talk about the Xbox codename Lockhart, which is actually called we're assuming it's going to be called the Series S. I've been wanting to make a video about this for weeks because I'm basically in this kind of cycle of course, on quarantine, I know you guys know, but there's so many hours in the day, and you can't fill them all with stuff. And so I've just been trying to watch, basically every day I search multiple times for different videos about the Xbox and PS5, and I just watch every bit of content that I can. I'm just trying to eke out every little piece of information, and it's been frustrating because people keep talking about this. Okay, so let's go back about a year or whatever, and there's a lot of speculation that, excuse me, hiccup, Xbox was going to be doing 2 consoles. See that? I was not going fast enough. And so therefore, when I push the gas down, it just slides. And then now the tires are hot, so now I can't even go straight. So you hear me just kind of ginger the throttle here while the tires cool off for a second. There we go, now we're good. So there was just all this talk about Xbox making 2 consoles, one regular powered console and then one lesser powered console. And at the time, I thought it was a logical idea. And as we've gone through, I also still have thought it's kind of a logical idea, but recently, like the last 6 months, we've heard nothing about it, and they've revealed what the Series X looks like and all that kind of stuff. And Phil Spencer's coming out and talking about, the target of 4K 60 and all that kind of stuff, which of course they can't force developers to do 60 frames a second, but they certainly can give them the power to do it, and then make it so that the only reason they wouldn't do it is because the developer has some other thing in mind, and that's what they've done with this Series X. But for whatever reason, they just they haven't said anything about this lesser console. And as time's gone on, I've just started thinking more and more about it, and I've just started thinking it makes less and less sense to actually release a lower powered console. And it's just been really bugging me because I just keep thinking, like, there's no way they're going to do this lesser powered console. And then I started thinking of the logistics of it, and I started realizing, like, first of all, why would they do that? Okay, because they're releasing a new console to showcase what the next generation can do. If they release some low-tier, crappy console that's really cheap, like, how does that benefit them? How does that showcase what is... Yeah, see how I kept much more speed through the turn that time? It was like over 100 at least, and I was able to stay with the tires on the ground. And yeah, that's just not dragging enough. I didn't need to swerve that much to avoid him, but... So, they're showcasing this next gen as, like, what the power of these consoles can do and how much they can actually do and what kind of graphics they can have and all that. And if you're releasing a console that supposedly is as weak as a the rumors say it is, there's no reason to release a console like that. It's just going to hurt you, ultimately, in the end, so that people don't see the true power of a console, and sort of negates coming out with a new generation. Like, if you create a console that's significantly less powerful than the top dog console, then what's the point of that? So I've always known that they would absolutely do a weaker console eventually. The Series X wouldn't be the most powerful, or maybe it would, but I always thought they would do a weaker one eventually. But the more people have talked about it, the more I just start thinking, like, it doesn't make sense for them to do that. It just doesn't. And then we got into the power of the Series X, which was released in November, or, well, kind of in November, and then now we have it confirmed, all the different power stuff about it, and I just think, you know, I think there's a real misconception among people who are saying that this Xbox Lockhart codename is actually going to be a thing, and as is the case with me with everything that I end up, almost every opinion I end up having, there's an immediate opinion, which is like, oh yeah, you know, like, there's going to be a lesser console, and then there's a second level opinion, which is like, hey, that actually doesn't make sense. Like, logistically, that just doesn't make sense. Strategically, it doesn't make sense. Why would they do that? And then there's a third level of more realization of like, you know what, maybe they will actually do that. And it's unfortunate for me because it takes me 2 levels to get back to the point, just everybody who just reads a thing and believes it, they're like, oh yeah, there's going to be an Xbox Lockhart, it's less powerful. And they just buy into it right away. Now, the reason I did this race a second time was because that was actually reverse. I hadn't meant to do Prague on reverse. That's what this track is called. And so I was like, well, you know what? Now that I got the feel for the car, I'm gonna do it on regular forward. And look, again, first turn, I'm out. So it sucks for me because everybody just agrees that they're gonna do it, and I'm like, yeah, maybe they will. And then I look at it more and I go, no, do some research. They would never do that. And then the third level is like, okay, maybe they will do that. So it takes me longer to get to that same conclusion, but it's more based on, you know, facts and reality and logical sense than the people who are just like, oh, they're going to make this Xbox Lockhart. So I'm back to thinking they might actually do it, and we're going to go over some of that stuff now, why I think they would. And it's basically only because of something that came to light recently that makes me go, you know what, I think maybe they will. So the rumors have been that they're going to do a 4 to 6 teraflop console that would be the Xbox Lockhart, whereas the Series X is a 12 teraflop. So, you know, on first glance, you think, well, that doesn't, I mean, why would they do that? Because that's a console that won't be able to run 4K if they do that, or very limited 4K. And it's like, that's going to sacrifice the quality of the games because, you know, if they're going to have something weaker like that, and then you start thinking, well, if they're going to have a weaker console, then the games are going to be held back because they're going to have to work on this lesser powered console. It's like, that doesn't make sense to me. So then I started realizing also, like I said, I'm going to lay out my arguments first why I thought there was not going to be one, and then now why I think there might be. So initially, that was my thought, was like a 6 teraflop console, that's half the power. Why would they do that? They're basically weakening the generation, so it's not even going to be like generational leap if you go to a Lockhart console. And then people are talking about the price. They're saying like, oh, it's going to be $300, and you think, okay, let's look at something here real quick, okay? So when you're looking at the consoles, there's basically 3 main costs. You can fit everything else. You can fit motherboards, Wi-Fi cards for the controllers, the actual plastic of the console itself, the fans, the heatsink, the power supply, the Blu-ray drive. You can pretty much factor all that into a small category of like maybe 10% of the cost. So 10 or 10 or 15% of the cost would be all those components. But mainly what you're looking at is there's a 3-part cost to the consoles. And like I said, all those other components combined, which are all the other pieces, they do make up a really small percentage. So basically the 3 main costs of the console are the chip, meaning the CPU and the GPU, the SoC, that chip. The RAM is another part. And then the storage. So each of those 3 essentially make up a third of the cost of the console. Again, all those other components are a very small percentage, but all those components basically make up a third of the price of the console each. Okay? So when people are saying there's going to be an Xbox Lockhart and it's going to be $300, they don't realize what it's going to take for a console to be $300. Because even if you cut the GPU in half, the GPU and you can't cut the CPU in half. They're not going to do that. Basically, what's going to happen is if they do a Lockhart, It's going to have the same CPU. It's just going to be the GPU that's weaker. And the reason you would do that is because you can actually scale the resolution down, so you could run it at 1080p, and then everything would basically be the same. So even if you cut the cost of the CPU, GPU in half, because again, the CPU is a percentage of that you won't be able to reduce. The GPU you can maybe reduce. So if you were to reduce the CPU and GPU by half, that's 1/2 of 1/3 of the cost of the console, which is 1/6. Okay? If the console is going to be $500, which it's probably going to be, it could even be cheaper depending on what Sony does. Microsoft is going for broke this time. If that's the case, then you're talking about 1/6 of $500. Okay? 1/5 of $500 would be $100. So 1/6 is probably like $80. So that means if you were to cut the GPU and CPU costs in half, that means the console could be $420 to the $500 Series X. That's not good enough. That's not going to sell consoles. Okay? So then you realize if you cut it in a third, you're still only 1/3 of 33%. So that's, you know, well, I guess 2/3 of 33%. So that's 20 to 25%. So even if you did that, the cost of the console would go from $500 to $400 or $375. Again, that's not going to cut it. So when you start to do the research and you start to do the logistics of it, you realize if they were ever to do a Lockhart console, not only would they have to create a GPU that was 1/2 or less as powerful, they'd also have to cut the RAM down, and they'd also have to cut the storage down. And then you think, okay, well, if you reduce the RAM of the console, does that even make it a next-gen console? If you're going to reduce the RAM from 16 gigabytes, then is that even going to be a next-gen console? So you start to say, dude, they can't make a Lockhart console. They just can't. Cost-wise, they can't. The amount of power that they're squeezing into the Series X for $500 is ridiculous. And to go and do this on a lesser console, I don't think there's any way to do it. And so as I started realizing that, I started realizing, like, if you really wanted to get realistic about a Lockhart, you would have to make it 8 gigs of RAM instead of 16. You'd have to give it a 500 gig hard drive instead of a 1 terabyte hard drive, and you'd have to make the GPU half as powerful, maybe less. And if you did all that, then you might be able to get a Lockhart in at $300, $325. You might be able to do that. So that's when you say, why would they do that? The games wouldn't look as good. They'd have to run lesser settings, and they would have to reduce the quality of the games in order to do that. And you think, why would they do that when they're launching a next gen? The whole point of launching a next gen is to showcase the power of the console. And if you're reducing the GPU to a weak GPU, then how could you even do that? So yeah, it seems like they're not doing it, and just the amount of people talking about it like it's a done deal. Well, when are we going to hear about the Lockhart? Well, they haven't announced the Lockhart yet, so they're going to announce that soon. And it's just like, you guys are just taking for granted that they're doing that. Like, logistically and strategically, it doesn't make any sense for them to do that. So I've been getting really upset about it, and I've gotten so mad about it. I've wanted to make a video, like I said, for weeks about it, and I keep getting upset, and I don't want to do it because I keep getting more and more mad every time I think about it. I'm just like, I can't believe how foolish these guys are, that they're actually thinking they're going to do that Microsoft's actually going to release a console that's that low powered in the next gen. Like, why would anyone buy the Series X? If you can just buy the Series S and get most of the same features, why would you spend $500 on the Series X if you could just spend $300 on this? I mean, come on, guys, let's be real. No new console has ever launched at $300. That's ridiculous. If it's launching for $300, that means the technology in it is not powerful enough, or not forward-thinking enough to actually justify a next-gen console if it's that cheap. And there's still part of me that thinks that. Okay, so here's what's happened recently that's sent me from 99% certainty that they wouldn't release a new console to 80% certainty that they won't release a weaker console. So the RAM that they use currently in the Xbox One X is called GDDR5, and the RAM that they have in the new consoles is GDDR6. So GDDR6 is extremely fast, and GDDR5 is not as fast, but it's not slow, but it's been the PC standard for a few years on graphics cards, and so it's going away now, and GDDR6 is being introduced. Now what that means is that there's virtually no demand anymore for GDDR5. So all the manufacturers that make memory, and basically the 5 just denotes a generation. So the GDDR6 is just the newest version of GDDR5, but it's basically redone kind of a thing, and it's faster and more efficient. So there's only a few memory manufacturers in the world. And what this means is that the GDDR5 is starting to become more and more rare because there's fewer and fewer companies actually making GDDR5 anymore. And what that means is it's harder to get supply of GDDR5, and it's also hampering the cost of GDDR6 a little bit, because if everybody just switched over to GDDR6, then they'd be producing so much that the cost would come down, and that's where we're headed. But really what's happening is there's actually a shortage of GDDR5 in the world right now because there's basically no more manufacturers making it. And NVIDIA has actually switched one of their lowest end cards. It costs like $150. They've actually switched it to GDDR6 because they actually just can't source GDDR5 anymore. And so this actually throws a wrinkle into things, because if you can't produce the older consoles, then what do people buy who want a cheaper console? So like, we're not talking about, we are talking about how it's at the point now where like the GDDR5 is so rare that they actually probably can't even keep producing consoles anymore. In fact, there's already rumors that the Xbox One X is going to be discontinued, and I would have to think that's probably true, because the GDDR5 is just becoming basically impossible to find, and there's not going to be a cheaper option for consoles. So then you pair that with the fact that if you run anything off of last generation, the CPU is so weak, it's not going to be able to do anything on the current if the new generation coming in, the Series X, has all these powerful games, it's not going to be able to keep up. The GPU is really not a big deal at all. They can scale down the resolution and run it at 1080p if they want it, or whatever, 1440p, but the CPU is really going to be the issue. So when I started thinking about it, I started thinking like, okay, if there's no GDDR5 for them to make these older consoles, and the CPUs can't keep up, they're going to have to release something new, because otherwise the generation is going to be held back. So it's actually an opportunity for Microsoft to get people off of the last generation hardware and onto the new generation of hardware. So this is where I think, okay, you know what? Maybe they will do this. And only because of supply shortages with the GDDR5 and issues with, not wanting to stagnate the generation of all the people, because they're still supporting the Xbox One, but the amount of people who aren't going to have a respectable console and won't have decent CPU power on their console to actually run these new games, because the CPU, like, again, the GPU power, they can scale down the resolution and all that and scale that back, that's okay, but the CPU is basically like into the game design. Like, the CPU is the particle effects, the smoke in the air, the amount of AI on the screen, the amount of people within a city, the amount of cars in a race, the frame rate, like all that kind of stuff is all dependent on the CPU. So if you've got a ridiculously underpowered CPU like this generation is, you're basically hamstrung by that. So it would actually make some sense for Microsoft to release a console with the updated CPU and basically just have a weaker GPU. And so here we are, me coming full circle to thinking like, you know what, maybe there will actually be a Series S, weaker one. And the only reason I would say that is because some of these insiders that I've heard talking about it have basically said recently, oh no, it's going to be an 8 gig system. And I think like, okay, well, I mean, that's pretty much on par with what I said needed to happen in order for them to do it. So we're talking about an 8 gig system. So now what they say is it's a 4 teraflop GPU. Now, for reference, the current GPUs, it's called GCN. That architecture is a little bit different than the Navi architecture, RDNA 2. So 4 teraflops of Navi RDNA 2 architecture is roughly equivalent to about 5.5 or 6 teraflops of GCN architecture, which is what we're on now. And funny enough, the Xbox One X actually has about 6 teraflops of GPU power. So the fact that this console might actually be about as powerful as the One X, which the One X has a really powerful GPU and it's never been the issue on the One X. It's always been the CPU. So the reports are that it's going to be a 4 teraflop GPU, 8 gigs of RAM. Now, I actually think, for different reasons, I think it's going to be 10 gigabytes of RAM because they have a custom wide bus on the Series X, which is a 320-bit bus, which actually has 10 modules of RAM. a mix of 1 and 2 gigabytes per module, which makes up 16. So I actually think that they will do 10 gigabytes of RAM on the One S, so that they have 2 reserved for the system and 8 reserved for games. That's my thought. And then the GPU will be a 4 teraflop GPU. CPU will be exactly the same, 8 cores, 16 threads at 3.6 gigahertz. And then I think that they're going to have to cut the storage down too. So I think if they were to do that, if they cut the storage down, they can even maybe do 750 gigs. But if they cut the storage down, and if they cut the GPU down, and if they cut the RAM down, yes, they can make a Lockhart console that is less powerful and could launch for $300. But they'd have to be drastically less. And basically what I think they'll do is I think they'll just make it a 1080p console. That's a 1/4 resolution of 4K. So if they cut that down, that means the GPU could be 1/4 as powerful, which means that it could be 3 teraflops even, and it would basically be the same power as the Series X, but they would just run it at 1080p instead of 4K. And the reason they would do that is because to keep parity between the consoles, basically. Because currently the Xbox One X runs at about 4K medium settings. When you go to a PC, you can choose your resolution, 1080p, 1440p, 4K, whatever you want, even 720p. And then you have your settings. And the settings are everything from shadow quality to anti-aliasing, which is like the shinies and the shimmeries that you see in certain games, like on the fences and in trees and stuff like that, from stuff at a distance. And then you have texture filtering, and you have all these different quality settings that basically make the game more rich and more full. And I'm sure all of you have seen those guys on stream who play like competitive shooters and stuff, and their games look like crap on a PC, and that's because they run at the lowest possible settings so they can get the highest possible frame rate. So, trees don't look good, sidewalks don't look good, no reflections don't look good. All that kind of stuff is tied to the actual settings. And so currently the consoles, the Xbox One X, which can do 4K, runs at about 4K medium. And if you take the same game and you run it on a PC at 4K Ultra, it looks so much better, it's ridiculous. The reflections are better, texture's better, just the quality in general, the richness and the fullness and the completeness of the game. Sometimes the lower settings, like medium and below, look like they're missing something. And so if you have a console with this Series S that's basically going to be about as powerful as the Xbox One X, the GPU is never the issue in the first place. The CPU is the issue. So they really are kind of forced in this position where you would think like, well, hey, they'll just make the Xbox One X cheaper, and that can be like the standard of people who just want to buy a cheaper console and don't want to pay for the more expensive stuff. But that's not going to work because, first of all, they can't even make the Xbox One X anymore, it would seem, with the RAM issue, the GDDR5 RAM issue. And then also, the CPU is so much weaker, it's almost half the power, which is a real problem. And this is not a matter of like, oh, certain games won't run as well. Like, legitimately, if they design a game for the next generation exclusively, it's not going to run on the previous generation because of that CPU power. So I think Microsoft is actually in a difficult position, but also an envious position, where they actually have the opportunity to accelerate the adoption of this new generation. And the way they're going to have to do that is it's going to have to be a 1080p machine. That's just how it's going to work. This would allow for developers to develop exactly the same, keep all the shadows, the anti-aliasing, the textures, the reflections, to keep all that stuff exactly the same, and just scale the resolution down to 1080p, and that'll be it. They won't have to do really much more optimization than that. They're not going to have to go through one by one and be like, oh, we need to have this setting changed to this and that. And I think if you don't give the developers that, they're not going to develop a game for the more advanced console. So I think that's what's going to happen. It's going to have to be a 1080p machine running at quarter resolution of the 4K, and they'll just keep everything else the same. I've done this voiceover take like 8 times at this point, and each time I do it, I become about 10% more convinced that they're going to do it. So right before your eyes, I've been changing my mind about this lesser console, and I think I'm about 70-30 right now that they're going to do it. And I'm actually convinced that it's actually a good thing, because if there's one out there for $300, then that might entice people to buy that instead of something cheaper, instead of like a 1S or something, or a 1X that's still around on shelves. They might be able to buy this one for $300. They might as well, because that'll still give them the CPU. So here's what it's going to be. It's going to be, this is my opinion, okay? But I'm very confident. It's going to be a 4 teraflop GPU. That's what I've been hearing. That makes sense. That's a good number. That's about where they'd have to cut it to in order to reduce the cost enough for it to be $300. So that's accurate. And that's enough reduction that they could run the game at the same settings at 1080p, and everything would basically run exactly the same. Wouldn't have to change a darn thing other than the 4K to 1080p. Okay? I don't want to rule out the possibility that it could be 12 gigabytes of RAM. If you look at the Series S, or Series X, excuse me, guys, the names are getting so confusing throwing all these around, man. And I don't usually have issues with stuff like that, but the Series S or the Series X has the 10 gigabytes of RAM optimized for games, and then it has the other 6 gigabytes, 2 of that's for system memory or something, and then 4 that's a little bit slower RAM. So I wouldn't also rule out the possibility that they would go up to 12 gigs of RAM in the Lockhart Series S console, which is parity with the current Xbox One X, which would allow them 10 gigabytes for games and 2 gigabytes for the system. And that way, again, it would have parity, so the developers wouldn't have to do anything. It would have the same RAM allocation, one or the other. And it also would allow them to keep the same bandwidth because they'd have the same custom 320-bit wide bus. So you get the same memory bandwidth, roughly, which means they wouldn't have to make any changes there either. And then they would just have it be a 1080p machine instead of a 4K machine. I think that's the only way they can do it. And the other thing is they're going to have to reduce the storage. Especially if they go to 12 gigabytes or 10 gigabytes, the storage is going to have to be cut down. I'm of the mind that if they go to 12 gigabytes, it'll be a 500 gig hard drive. But I think CPU is exactly the same. Zen 2, 3.6 gigahertz, 8 core, 16 threads. I think the GPU is a 4 teraflop GPU that's a 1080p machine. And I think the storage goes to, at the maximum, 750 gigabytes, probably 500 gigabytes. And I think that's how they do it. They picture it, they throw it out there as a budget, entry-level, 1080p, half storage introduction for the Xbox new series, the new Xbox. So, let me know what you guys think. Thanks for sticking around. This is a little bit longer than usual, but I hope you enjoyed it. See you guys later.